The fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent electric buzz that grated against his nerves. Michael stood in the sterile hallway, his knuckles white as he gripped the plastic bag. Inside, a few personal items shifted with every shallow breath he took. He walked through the automatic doors and into the parking lot, the cold night air biting at his face, but he felt nothing. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and distant sirens. When he finally turned the key in his front door, the silence of the house hit him like a physical blow. It was not empty, it was heavy. He stepped into the foyer and listened. No movement, no greeting. The air held the faint, lingering scent of a life that had been interrupted. He placed the bag on the entryway table and stared at the dark living room. Every corner of the house seemed to amplify the absence. He walked to the center of the room, his boots clicking sharply against the floorboards, but the sound died instantly. He stood there, hands at his sides, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. The house had become a tomb of memories, and he was the only one left to guard them. The sun offered no comfort when it hit the windowsill at 6. The alarm clock screamed, shattering the fragile peace of the morning. Michael moved with a stiff, practiced efficiency. He navigated the kitchen, reaching for bread and jam, his movements jerky and hurried. Lunchboxes clicked shut. Backpacks were zipped. He drove through gray traffic, knuckles tight against the wheel, his mind racing through the mounting stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. Each day morphed into a rhythmic, soul-draining loop. He returned home to the evening rush of homework and half-hearted dinners. Through it all, his 7-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son watched him from the floor. They did not speak. They did not cry. They simply sat, their eyes tracking his every frantic movement, searching for a stability he could no longer anchor. He felt their gaze on his back like a physical weight. He would turn to offer a hollow smile, but the words died in his throat. He had no answers for them. He had only the next task, the next chore, and the relentless, grinding fatigue that settled into his bones by midnight. He was drowning, and the clock never stopped ticking. Tuesday night arrived with a heavy, stagnant air. The children were finally asleep, leaving the house in a hollow, ringing stillness. Michael pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. He did not reach for the bills. He did not check his watch. He simply let his shoulders drop, his spine curving until his chest felt crushed against the edge of the wood. The single overhead light flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that crawled across the linoleum. A stack of unpaid notices sat near his elbow, their edges curling in the dry heat of the room. He stared at the center of the table, his eyes unfocused, tracking a single ant moving across the surface. His hands lay open and limp. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air felt thin, barely reaching his lungs. The refrigerator hummed a low, abrasive note that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his skull. He leaned his forehead against the cool, hard surface of the table. Every muscle in his neck throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. He was not thinking of the future. He was not mourning the past. He was simply existing in a state of total, absolute depletion. He remained motionless, a dark shape against the stark white light, waiting for something to change, yet knowing nothing would. A soft scraping sound cut through the refrigerator hum. Michael did not look up. A small hand slid a piece of paper across the scarred wood of the table, stopping just inches from his limp fingers. He blinked, the movement feeling heavy. He focused on the paper. It was a crude, crayon-drawn scene of 3 stick figures holding hands. Above them, the letters were shaky, oversized, and misspelled, but the message remained clear. My dad is my hero. The silence in the kitchen deepened. Michael reached out, his fingertip tracing the thick, waxy lines of the drawing. The ink of the paper felt rough against his skin. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that tore through the quiet. He tried to swallow, but his throat tightened. He pushed the chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor, and he stood up only to find his knees failing. He leaned back against the wall and slowly slid down, his back scraping the plaster until he hit the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, the paper clutched in his trembling hands. The crushing weight of the past months did not vanish, but it shifted, turning from a leaden burden into a sharp, piercing clarity. He sat there, his shoulders shaking, as the paper crumpled slightly in his grip. Michael stayed on the floor for a long time, his eyes fixed on the empty space near the refrigerator. He eventually turned his head toward the bookshelf mounted in the corner. His gaze landed on a worn copy of Napoleon Hill, its spine cracked and the cover faded from years of neglect. He pushed himself up, his muscles stiff, and reached for the book. He sat on the floor again, thumbing through the pages until he found the passage he had marked years ago. His eyes locked onto the ink. A person with a definite purpose can find strength far beyond what they believe they possess. He read the line 3 times, his lips moving silently with the words. The static in his mind began to quiet. He set the book aside and stood up. He did not slump this time. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs, feeling the tension in his legs. He walked to the hallway and stood at the entrance to the children's bedroom. He listened to the rhythmic, soft breathing coming from within. The house felt different. The air was no longer stagnant. He looked at the closed door, his jaw set, and his hands balled into firm fists. He was no longer a man adrift. He was a foundation. At 5 the next morning, the alarm clock buzzed. Michael did not hit snooze. He sat up, the cold air hitting his skin, and walked to the kitchen table. He opened a ledger and a technical manual, his pen moving in steady, measured strokes. He tracked every penny spent on milk, bread, and electricity, drawing red lines through anything that did not serve their survival. The fatigue was a physical ache in his shoulders, but he leaned into the light of the desk lamp and kept reading. He took on an extra shift at the warehouse, his boots heavy as he walked the loading docks for 12 hours straight. He returned home to the smell of reheated leftovers, his hands stained with engine grease and warehouse dust. He did not rest. He opened his books again, studying financial management until his eyes burned. He cut the cable subscription, sold the unused furniture, and banked every surplus dollar into a locked savings account. His movements became mechanical, precise, and relentless. There was no room for hesitation in his new schedule. Every action, from the early morning study sessions to the late-night labor, was a brick in the wall he was building to protect the 2 lives sleeping down the hall. Years passed, and the house shifted. The walls were no longer draped in shadows. They held framed certificates, graduation photos, and the steady, quiet hum of a stable life. The kitchen, once a site of frantic late-night budgeting, now functioned with a rhythm of calm. Then came the Tuesday that broke the pattern. The front door opened and shut with a sharp, heavy thud. Michael looked up from his work to see his son standing in the kitchen doorway. The boy did not reach for his backpack or head toward the pantry. He stood still, his shoulders hunched, staring at the floorboards. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, the results of a high-stakes exam. He dropped the paper onto the table. The corner caught on the edge and stayed curled. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet they had cultivated over the years. It was thick, heavy, and cold. The boy did not look up. He turned his head away, his breathing shallow and jagged. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the old familiar weight of defeat returned to the space. Michael stood up. The chair scraped against the linoleum, a harsh sound that cut through the boy's ragged breathing. He walked over and placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. The boy flinched, but Michael did not pull away. He squeezed firmly, grounding the younger man. "Being knocked down is not failure," Michael said, his voice level and devoid of pity. "Staying down is." He guided his son to the kitchen table and cleared away the dinner plates. He pulled out a fresh notepad and a pen. "We do not ignore the result," he continued, pointing at the red marks on the exam paper. "We analyze them." He began to map out a new study schedule, breaking the failed subject into granular, daily tasks. He drew a line down the center of the page, one side for the mistakes made, the other for the specific steps to correct them. He watched as his son's hands stopped trembling. The boy picked up the pen and wrote the first correction. Michael remained standing there, his hand still resting on the boy's back, monitoring the rhythm of his writing until the tension in the room dissipated and the focus shifted from the past failure to the clear, actionable path forward. The house was quiet, but for a different reason now. Sunlight flooded the kitchen where they once tallied bills. Years later, that same light filled a sprawling university auditorium. Michael sat in the center row, leaning forward as the names were called. Every graduate walked across the stage, but his eyes tracked only one. When his daughter's name echoed through the hall, he stood up. He did not shout, but he gripped the back of the seat in front of him until his knuckles turned white. She walked to the center of the stage. She stopped before the dean, extended her hands, and took the heavy, rolled parchment. The audience erupted into applause, a wall of sound that vibrated through the floorboards beneath his feet. She looked out into the crowd, her face bright under the stage lights. Michael exhaled, a long, slow breath that released the last remaining tension of those early, desperate years. The shadows were gone. In their place sat the tangible result of a decade of discipline. He watched her turn and walk off the stage, holding the diploma high. The cycle of survival had ended, replaced by the reality of a life built from the ground up. Later that evening, the house felt different. The graduation caps and gowns were piled on the sofa, and the air held the scent of coffee and celebration. His daughter sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once sat in the dark, counting coins. She looked at him, life, gaze clear and steady. "Dad, how did you do it?" she asked. Michael looked at her, then toward the hallway where his son was now working at his own desk. He did not look for a profound answer. He reached out and tapped the wood of the table, a solid, grounding sound. "I stopped asking whether I could handle it," he said. "I started focusing on who needed me to." He watched her process the words. He had not conquered the world, nor had he sought to. He had simply built a wall against the void, one day at a time, until the foundation was too thick to break. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the streetlights. The grief of the past was no longer a weight. It was a compass. He had found a purpose larger than his own pain, and in doing so, he had become unbreakable. The cycle was complete.